When I was in seminary, I had the opportunity to go on a 3-week-long trip to the Middle East and to Greece. There were students from a number of seminaries on this particular trip, and we spent a great deal of time together on charter buses. One day we were riding in one of those buses through a rather hilly section of the West Bank in Israel. And I was up against the window looking out to see what there might be to see. As I looked down into a small valley there just below the bus, I noticed a young Palestinian boy, maybe 10 or 12 years old, who was walking down a small path through that valley. And right behind him, in a little single file line, were a handful of sheep. I watched him for as long as I could see him as he descended into the valley, that little line of sheep right behind him. I learned later that what I saw was typical of shepherding in that part of the Middle East. The families often had very small flocks, a dozen or less, and they were often in charge of one of the children. And in the morning when they would leave the house, the child would call to the sheep, and the sheep would follow, knowing that their young shepherd would take them to food. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Many years ago, at the church I served in Columbus, Ohio, we were having our weekly staff meeting, and as was the practice, we would read and discuss the scripture that would be used in worship that coming Sunday. On this particular occasion, the very same scripture that we're using today. And right after I finished reading the passage, the parish associate pastor said, "Sheep like to go their own way." Bob was a retired pastor who worked for us a few hours a week, mostly helping with pastoral care. And it turned out that early in his ministry, he had served a church in Montana, a congregation that had several sheep farmers. And they're the ones that had told him, sheep like to go their own way. You have to really watch them closely. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Clearly, the sheep that I saw out of that charter bus window really knew their shepherd well. They were perfectly happy to follow him, but if sheep like to go their own way, then perhaps they wander off sometimes. I don't suppose that little boy would just walk along and never look back over his shoulder to see what was happening, to see if one had straggled off, to see if one had decided to go on its own search for some tasty grass. Those sheep following that little boy looked a lot like a line of kindergarten students following the teacher to the cafeteria. And I suppose kindergarten students like to go their own way too, and so certainly no teacher worth their salt would say, let's go to the cafeteria, and then just head off and never look back again. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. I say that Jesus is my shepherd, that he's the one I follow, but I like to go my own way too. Too often, I've headed off in a direction that's not a particularly good one. Sometimes people have tried to point that out to me, but I've just stuck to the course, compounding my initial error in going the wrong way. It seems sometimes that I can be my own worst enemy. Maybe that's a bigger problem for me than it is for you. But I think that most of us have sometimes gone our own way with less than stellar results. We humans seem to have a significant capacity for self-destructive behavior, for damaging relationships that we cherish, for heading off in directions that we should know better, but somehow the lure of going our own way keeps pulling us along. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Back when I was in that staff meeting at that Columbus, Ohio church, it didn't occur to me that I should have asked a question to Bob, the parish associate, about his statement, "Sheep like to go their own way." I should have asked what sort of shepherding, what kind of herding those Montana farmers did. It's too late to ask now, but I feel fairly confident that the shepherding that was happening in Montana looked very little like what I saw in the Middle East. Likely those Montana flocks were quite large, and they had to be driven from one pasture to another. Perhaps the farmer was on horseback or riding a four-wheeler, and likely there were dogs that helped as they prodded and pushed and herded sheep in directions they often did not want to go. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Seems to me that very often religion looks more like the Montana version of shepherding than it does like the one I saw from the charter bus window. We pastors are largely responsible for that. There's no malice involved. Pastors spend a lot of time trying to convince, urging people to engage in behavior that's not really all that natural, to love your enemies, to pray for those who hate you, to let go of wealth, even your own life. But it's a pretty easy move to go from convincing and urging to start pushing. Very often, pastors end up pushing people to be more faithful, to be more generous, to engage in the ministries of the church, to be more countercultural, to do the hard work of justice and social righteousness, to prayerfully listen for Jesus' call, and so on. Jesus tells us to do all these things, and often we pastors quote Jesus when we're doing our urging and convincing and pushing. But I suspect that often it feels very little like being beckoned to follow. It feels like being pushed, being herded. Perhaps it even worked back in the time when pastors were held in high esteem, when they were considered voices of authority. But that was a long time ago. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. In John's gospel, that term know is a thick word filled with meaning. It can simply mean to know, to be acquainted with. It can also mean to understand or to realize. But in our passage, it means much more. It speaks to a level of intimacy and trust, to be known by Jesus and to know Jesus is a lot like Jesus' relationship with the Father. I am the Good Shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me and I know the Father. Jesus' sheep follow him in the difficult work of discipleship that loves enemies, that prays for those who hate them, that lets go of wealth, even of self. And they do that because they have come to know and trust the shepherd in much the same way that Jesus knows and is known by the Father. And through this deep knowing, the sheep are able to follow in places they would never have gone on their own. I am the Good Shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. But this sort of deep knowing that I'm talking about does not come quickly or easily. It takes time. It requires a desire to know Jesus deeply. Like all intimate relationships, there must be time spent together, learning to know one another, learning to trust one another. And for us, the primary ways of coming to know Jesus intimately, deeply, are Scripture and prayer. There are no shortcuts. There are no quick fixes. There's no magic formula. You must spend the time. You must spend time with Jesus. Get to know Jesus. Let him become your companion in life. Come to trust him. And finally, know him as your shepherd. I am the Good Shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. Jesus already knows you. He is just waiting for you to come to know him, to trust him, so that he may lead you in the way of life in all its fullness. All praise and glory to the God who comes to us in Jesus the Good Shepherd, comes to us to show us the way. Thanks be to God.